Okay, first things first is we're gonna go ahead and remove the ignition coils on this side, and we're gonna go ahead and remove all of the wiring that goes to all the components, and then we're gonna go ahead and remove the intake box, then all this wiring on top here. And then the last thing you want to do before you start removing the intake is you want to go ahead and blow off the entire intake, because this one obviously has a whole bunch of rat's nest stuff in here, but you want to blow off all the dirt and everything so it doesn't get inside the intake. 10mm bolts. If these things break, it's okay. I'll show you how to secure the connectors without the little tabs. Remove the ignition coils. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and remove this rail here, and there's this bolt here, 10mm here, and underneath this hose that goes to the intake, there's another bolt, another 10mm bolt that holds down this entire rail here that has all the purge valves. So we're gonna go ahead and remove the purge valves. I'm gonna have to remove this hose because the bolt is underneath this hose, so I'm gonna pop it off from the intake right here. If it's hard to come off, just go ahead and get some pliers and grab the hose and just wiggle it back and forth until it breaks loose. Then you can pop it off. Now we can go ahead and remove this entire assembly here. The last thing I'm going to need to do is just disconnect it, the evap lines going to it. And then I'm gonna just move it out of the way. I'm not gonna fully remove it because I don't want to be disturbing all these hoses, because sometimes they break. So just be really careful and mindful of that. So I like to just put stuff out of the way if I can and not remove it. This one though, I can remove a few of the hoses. Just give me a little bit more wiggle room. And the last thing is you want to make sure that you keep track of where all these vacuum lines go, because sometimes the vacuum diagrams aren't very good, and it's gonna be very difficult for you to figure out where these lines go to. So just keep that in mind and keep track of where everything goes. Okay, so I went ahead and removed the hose that goes to this valve over here on the intake, and then I'm gonna remove the hose that goes from the intake box. It goes here to the intake itself. Okay, got those out of the way. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna vacuum all of this stuff up, because I don't want any of that to fall inside the intake. Okay, now that we vacuumed it all up, I'm gonna go ahead and blow it off with my my blowgun. The reason I didn't do this first is because I don't want all that stuff all over the place. I don't want it all over my shop, so I try to clean it up as much as I can, then get the rest of it with the blowgun, and then one more time with the vacuum. But I'm gonna go ahead and blow it off. Now that that's out of the way, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the intake box and the intake tube and get that out of the way so I can start removing the coolant lines that go to the throttle body. Once I do that, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the crossbar. Then I'm gonna start removing the intake and get that out of the way. I'm telling you guys, mark up the freaking vacuum lines, because if you don't, you're gonna forget where they go. I guarantee you, you're gonna be mad. You're gonna be like, I should have listened to Master. You know, so the way I like to do it is I like to do like different marks. You know what I'm saying? So like this line, it's gonna have like 4 little dots, and then over here, I'm gonna put like 4 little dots as well, so that I know that this line goes on this nipple. This one only has 1, so it goes there. And this thing just popped off, so I'm probably gonna put that there, and then that there, and then like all these lines are kind of like already routed, so like, you know, I'm not afraid of like, okay, I'm not gonna mix this one up here, you know what I'm saying, because this one already goes this way. But just in case, I'm put like another long line here, just so I can make sure I don't mess this up. Okay, and that's it. There's 2 more over here, but I don't think I'm gonna remove those. Disconnect the master airflow sensor. Okay, and then there's 10mm bolts that hold down the intake, the air cleaner box down. A 10mm with an extension. back. And then to get those, remove the hose clamps on the intake tube. That. Okay. This bad boy should pop up. Bring out the big guns. Pop this thing up. There we go. Okay. That on. Okay. Put that off. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and remove the hoses, the hose clamps that go to the other side of the intake. Pop these bad boys off. Before I do that, obviously, stuck. If these things get stuck, just go ahead and use a flathead and then pry it off. They just get stuck, no big deal. Okay. Then I'm gonna go ahead and remove the breather tube that goes from the valve cover to the intake. Use some pliers, remove this little hose clamp here. Again, use your pliers, grab the hose, just wiggle it back and forth just so you loosen it up. It becomes easier to remove. Okay. It's off. I don't have to remove it. I gotta just get it out of the way. Same thing with this thing. Now, a lot of times I don't like to remove cooling lines. I don't like to remove any of that stuff. So I don't think I'm gonna remove these lines yet. I'm gonna wait and see if I have to. If I don't have to, it's better just because I don't make a mess. And then I have to refill the cooling system. So hopefully I could just remove the intake and then pop it off and then just kind of move it out of the way so I can reach back there and then get to the coils. Obviously, the owner's manual is gonna tell you to remove these hose clamps and then remove the lines. But if you're trying to do this quickly and do it with the least mess as possible, you don't have, try not to remove them. But sometimes it's easier to remove things, so it's just like it's gonna be a call that you're gonna have to make. Right now, it looks like I'm not gonna have to remove them. I'm gonna remove the hose that goes to the brake booster. That's over here, up here, and then hopefully that'll give me enough room to lift this up and get it out of the way. First things first though, I'm gonna go ahead and remove this bar that attaches the two strut towers to each other. All right, to remove the strut bolts, I'm gonna go ahead and use my Ingersoll Rand 1/2 inch gun with a 14mm socket at the end of it. Just go ahead and pop them off. There's 3 on each side. Okay, now we got the crossbar off. I'm gonna go ahead and remove the brackets that attach the rear of the intake to the heads. There's a couple brackets back here that are very difficult to see without actually being in here, but one of them is right here, and it takes a 14mm bolt that attaches it to the intake. And there's another one over here that's very difficult to see, but the way I'm gonna get in there, I'll show you guys how to get in there. But this one, I'll show you what tools I use to get to that bolt. Just so you guys know, these are the brackets behind the intake. Here's one. Here's another one, and here's the last one that goes on the throttle body. So just so you guys know where they're at. Okay, and this is the little nipple that goes to the intake tube. Okay, so just so you guys know where they're at, they're right there. And on the intake, this is upside down. This is the little hose that goes to the top of the valve cover. This is one bolt hole. This is another bolt hole. And this is the one on the throttle body, or the 3 brackets that hold the back of the intake to the head. So I was able to get a 14mm wrench in there. This is a 14mm snap-on wrench. It's right around 8 inches long. So I broke it loose with the 14mm wrench. Then I'm gonna use a wrench, 14mm swivel head, flex wrench, gear wrench. I'm gonna go ahead and put this one in and then go ahead and start ratcheting it out. able to get the ratchet in there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and spin off the bolt. And I'll show you guys in a second. Okay, now that it's loose, I'm gonna use my fingers to get it off. Get that bolt off. It's pretty easy to spin off with your fingers. You do have to have a little bit of finger dexterity right here to get in there and remove this bolt, because you know, if your hands are pretty, if you're a mechanic, you know what I'm talking about. You get in there, but if you're just like a home mechanic, this might be a little bit difficult. But work through the pain, baby. Work through the pain. Boom. Got it out. The next bolt is very difficult to get to. You can't really see it, so you're gonna have to feel for it. If you go through the back over here of the throttle body, you could feel it. It's behind here. See that bar at the end of it? There's a bolt. And you're gonna have to remove that bolt, which is right here. And that's a 14 millimeter. And there's another bolt right behind that one. There's another bracket that attaches the intake to the head right behind it. So there's two of them. You'll be able to see it once you look in there. For the first bolt, the one that's attached to the throttle body, I'm gonna use a 6-inch 3/8 ratchet with a 12 millimeter long socket on it. That'll give me enough room to reach it. You can actually see that bolt from the top of the engine, so you shouldn't have any problems reaching it. The second bolt, I'm gonna go ahead and remove it with the 3/8 ratchet, 6-inch with a 12 millimeter socket at the end, short, and I'll be able to get in there, break it loose, then I'll probably be able to get it off with my fingers. I'll let you guys know how it goes. Okay, I'm finishing it off with a ratcheting wrench because it's a lot easier to maneuver this thing than it is a ratchet, but I did break it loose with the ratchet first. So now I'm gonna go ahead and remove it with a ratcheting wrench. Okay, cut the last one out. We're all set to remove the intake. Okay, now that we have the back bolts off the brackets, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the intake bolts. There's 6 of them here, I believe. So there's a few Allens, and then there's a few 14 millimeter nuts. So I think these are like 8 or 9 millimeter Allens, and then 14 millimeter nuts at the end. And then yeah, let's go ahead and remove those. Go ahead and remove the Allens first. 8 millimeter Allen on a 3/8 ratchet. Now the 14 millimeter bolts on the edge. Using a 14 millimeters with 12-inch ratchet with a 3-inch extension. Okay, now that they're loose, I'm gonna go ahead and use my electric gun to remove the rest of them. Remove it the rest of the way. Yep, the intake's loose now. I'm gonna go ahead and pop it off. Before I remove the intake, I'm gonna go ahead and blow everything off one more time and just try to get as much dust off the top of the engine as possible. Alright, unfortunately, I am gonna have to remove these coolant lines that go to the throttle body. Before I remove them though, I'm gonna make sure I put a pan underneath the car so coolant doesn't get all over the place. And then I'm gonna use these hose clamps, link in the description below to these bad boys, to block off the coolant hoses so they don't leak all over the place and make too much of a mess. Alright, we got both hoses off. The intake should be coming off now. Okay, so there's one more hose that I gotta remove from the valve cover to the intake, which is right there. I'm gonna go ahead and pop that off. Pretty easy. Those two little clamps are pretty easy to remove, and then you pop off the hose. Okay, I got the hose off. So now we can remove the intake. Jeez. Okay, one more hose to the brake booster. Hopefully there's nothing else holding it down. Okay. And voila! Okay, now we have full access to everything. Like I said before, I am gonna vacuum up all this stuff that's left over from our little friends, and change out the spark plugs, and then yeah, should be easy. 3 spark plugs back here. It's pretty easy to get to now. Got the intake in the way. Good to go. Before you remove the spark plugs, always blow out the holes to make sure that there's no debris that got stuck in there. Blow them out before you remove them, or else all that stuff is gonna get inside the cylinder. For these connectors that broke, the little tabs that broke, you want to use a little bit of silicone, like right here on the edge. So when you put them in, it'll kind of stick there, because right now it'll just pop off. It actually won't pop off because it's actually pretty strong in there, but I like to put a little bit of silicone in there, just kind of glue it on and make sure there's no issues. So I just throw a little bit of silicone there. Just a little dab is fine. Little dab. There we go on the edge, so it doesn't hit the connector, like the pins or anything like that. And you're good to go. Okay. When you're putting it back together, always make sure you clean the surfaces off on the intake. This is a very important piece. Make sure everything is nice and cleaned off. Use a little bit of brake clean on a clean rag once you take off the initial oil, and make sure everything's nice and clean. And then go ahead and replace the gasket on the intake. Make sure you put a brand new gasket on here and make sure it's nice and clean before you put the new gasket on. Then put the gasket on, and then you'll be able to put it on the engine once it's all nice and clean. Now, a lot of people don't replace these gaskets. I think it's kind of silly if you don't, because it's already off. The gasket's only a couple more bucks, but you know, I'm guilty of it too. I haven't replaced these in like some cars that I'm buying and selling because I don't want to spend the extra money, and I've never had a problem. But if you're doing this for a customer, it's always a good idea to go ahead and replace it, because it's pretty cheap and it's gonna save you some time in case it does leak or you do have any issues here. You'll at least know that that's a brand new gasket. So let's go ahead and clean that off. Put a new gasket on there, throw the intake on, and then go ahead and torque it down to the correct specs. Okay, I got pretty much everything done. The last thing I had to do was put this bar back on. And to do that, you're gonna have to raise the car up off the wheels just a little bit. And what that does is that it brings the towers in together so that you can slip on the crossbar, tighten it down, and then when you lower the car down, the strut towers stay kind of in the same position. So just know that you're gonna have to raise up the car to put on that strut bar.